So welcome to the College Hour Talk on Misinformation in U.S. Elections. I'm Professor Unmack. I teach in the Political Science Department, and my partner in crime today is Paul Bethel, who teaches in the History Department. We were originally going to have Alana Jeydel from the Poli-Sci Department was going to be the second presenter, but she took a job and moved to Pennsylvania. So Paul graciously agreed to not make me stand here all by myself and do this presentation.
I'm just here to keep her company.
A couple of housekeeping items. I did offer extra credit to my students, so if you're in one of my classes, I have a sign-up sheet here, so at the end of the presentation, you can sign up and I'll give you some extra credit. So we have a little bit of a theme for today, and our talk is on misinformation in U.S. elections, but one of the things that we wanted to start right from the very beginning to tell you is it's nothing new. Misinformation in elections is nothing new. People who have an interest in the outcome of elections have been trying to sway people's votes by presenting misinformation and pushing false information and false narratives since probably somebody accused Nero of not being a very good fiddler. Okay, that was like an ancient Rome joke. But what we want to do is talk about what might be different about the current political environment, what might be new, what maybe are some threats that we didn't have to face in our elections in the past, and then if there are solutions, what some of those solutions might be. And I don't want to give too much of a spoiler alert, but as I've been doing research, and I'm sure Professor Bethel too, as we've been researching things, this is probably not a problem that the government is going to be able to solve. So what we need to do, sort of as a society, is figure out what the problem is, what possible solutions there are, and what would be the best way to approach sort of protecting our democracy from the misinformation that could potentially influence the outcome of our elections. And so the way we're going to structure this talk is Paul's going to give some historical examples of attempts to sway elections through misinformation, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the scope of the problem, what other countries are trying to do to solve the problem, what some of the U.S. Solutions or attempts to solve the problem are going to be, and then we'll end our part of the discussion with some tools that potentially you could use to make sure that you don't fall victim to some of the misinformation that is out there in the sphere. If you've gone to a bunch of these talks already, some of the tools are probably going to be ones that you've already heard. So, but we know from psychological data that people tend to believe things if they hear them a lot. So that can either have a negative effect or a positive effect. So that's the way we're going to start. I don't have a problem with people interrupting me and asking questions. I don't know how Paul feels about that. So, all right. So I'm going to turn this over.
Hi. So I'm going to give the historical background, as Cindi said, and she's going to give all the real interesting answers. I'm just going to say what's already happened. But she's got
the funny stories. I don't have any funny.
She's got the problem-solving stuff. So again, this, like she said, this is nothing new. What's new is the technology. There was no Facebook 200 years ago. But that's not to say there was not social media. In fact, I was talking about this today. Social media was just going to the tavern, going to the town square and talking to people and hearing what was going on, whether it was accurate or inaccurate. This first slide here is just a couple of images of sort of classic election art in American history. George Caleb Bingham on your left. County election day, this is like the 1830s or something. Only men voting. But you can see they're voting very publicly. And I don't know if you can see all the images. There's a guy down in the right-hand corner over here drinking. they didn't close the bars on election day. People talking, people, I'm sure, politicking as it's going on. So that's a way of spreading stories. This other one, the Norman Rockwell one, there must be a Saturday Evening Post cover. I don't know if you can see all those images. It's not the clearest. It's the 1948 election between Dewey and Truman. And the man there has a paper with Dewey on it, and his obvious wife is upset with him. She's got a Truman sticker. Very contested election. But that's just a little introductory art. I'm going to give 4 examples of elections in American history. And the first one, and one of the most tightly contested elections really in all of American history, was 1800. John Adams, who was the sitting president, was running for a re-election against his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. In those days, there was no recognition in the elections of political parties. And there was also no separate, separate vote for president and vice president. So in 1796, Adams got the most electoral votes and was president. Jefferson got the second most votes and became vice president. But they disagreed on virtually everything. And then in 1800, there was a repetition of that contest. Adams, the Federalist, Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. And I think you know who won. I'll tell you that in a bit. But the interesting part from this point of view is the dirt that was flung. This is one of the dirtiest elections in American history. And I'm going to talk especially about what the Democratic Republicans said about John Adams. John Adams, first of all, for those of you who may not know much about him, from Massachusetts, from Quincy, Massachusetts, very straight-laced, very formal, devoted to his wife, Abigail, 6 children, no hanky-panky anywhere in his background. And yet one of the stories that circulated about Adams during this election, put forward by the Democratic Republican press, were various things, that he was trying to make the country into a monarchy, that he was going to destroy democracy, and some real serious charges. But one rumor that got circulated in Pennsylvania was that he had imported from Europe mistresses, both German mistresses and French mistresses. There was a heavy German population in Pennsylvania. And it wasn't so much the charge that he had mistresses that was upsetting, but the rumor circulated. Good try, yeah. The rumor circulated among the German population that in fact Adams had preferred the French mistresses over the German mistresses. And that angered the German population. And so votes were swayed towards Jefferson. So again, it wasn't the charge of having a mistress that was the problem. It was that he chose the French mistresses over the German mistresses. Pretty silly stuff. What wasn't so silly are some of the larger charges that later came out. For their point, the Federalists, Adams Party, charged that Jefferson was going to out to destroy religion and destroy all property, and basically create an anarchic mob rule situation that was similar to what was going on in France during the French Revolution, in the era of the French Revolution. But one Federalist said, that Jefferson is out to destroy religion and banish God from America. And none of those charges, of course, were correct. In the event, of course, Thomas Jefferson won in a very tightly contested election that had to be decided by the House of Representatives. Interestingly enough, too, a couple years after that election, during Jefferson's presidency, a newspaper came out, written by, of course, a Federalist, that accused Jefferson of keeping a mistress, one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, as his mistress. Of course, as many of you may know, that was not misinformation. That was, in fact, true. Jefferson never acknowledged that. But there's pretty clear evidence that he had a long-standing affair with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, and that 4 or perhaps 5 children she bore him. Jefferson's wife had died years earlier, so if that counts for anything. Okay. So, but that charge about Adams and his mistresses is kind of ludicrous, if you know anything about John Adams. Okay, a few years later, the election of the contest between John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, his oldest son, and Andrew Jackson. And this was similar in some ways to the 1800 election. John Quincy Adams was the sitting president, had been elected in 1824, had defeated, among other people, Andrew Jackson. Now here's the rematch. John Quincy Adams' party was known as the National Republicans, later to be called the Whig Party. And Andrew Jackson's party was the Democratic Party, and that's in its institutional history today's Democratic Party. Again, a very dirty election. And not so much, like the previous one, not so much from the point of view of these individual men leveling charges, but their supporters. The press that supported Adams put out a story about Andrew Jackson's wife that had a kernel of truth. And I think this, maybe, Cindi, you can touch on this, or this might be an example. I think some of the misinformation that we perceive in elections or that we're worried about is not, completely created from whole cloth, but there is this kernel of truth or a fact that then gets conflated into this story. And that was the case concerning Mrs. Jackson, Rachel Jackson, who had, they met, Rachel and Andrew, in Tennessee. She had been married to somebody early in her life, and he lit out. He run off, and she never saw him again. Some years later, she married Andrew Jackson, and they married. Well, technically, she was still married to this earlier guy, who I can't even remember his name. Many years later, during the 1820s, leading up to this election, his enemies dug up this story of Rachel Jackson's previous marriage that had never been annulled, nor had there been a divorce. And so they brought up this charge that Rachel Jackson was a bigamist. In fact, it even got conflated to be Rachel Jackson was a prostitute. I mean, these horrible charges against this, who everybody considered a prim and proper, sort of a staid, quiet, backwoods kind of lady. Horrible charges. Andrew Jackson was not a man to take insults or criticism very lightly. He was known as Old Hickory. He'd fought many duels. He had a bullet lodged in his spine from a duel. Of course, in that duel, the other guy had the bullet lodged in his brain, I think. So Andrew Jackson didn't lose the duels. And Jackson was furious, and the charges against Adams weren't so spurious or dirty, but just that he was playing dirty pool. Well, in the event, Andrew Jackson proved to be a very popular leader. He was the first candidate for president that had been born in a log cabin, that was born on the frontier. This popular image of this kind of regular guy. John Quincy Adams had attended Harvard. He spoke many languages. He was one of our most intellectual presidents. Well, as you may know, that doesn't always sell well with the American public. Andrew Jackson was just a tough old hickory nut, and he was an Indian fighter and a slave owner, and that appealed to the white men who were the only ones who could vote. So Andrew Jackson won the election. But tragically, Rachel Jackson, shortly after the election, died. And Andy Jackson blamed the Adams camp for basically killing her with these horrible charges against her character. She was so humiliated by this stuff. So that's a case where this misinformation didn't win the election for Adams, but it did, in its own way, contribute to the death of Mrs. Jackson. Andy Jackson never forgave Adams or that party, and he was pretty vindictive in that. Okay, this is an example in 1884, not so much of misinformation, but just a story that's too good to pass up. In fact, this is a story of real information that's used. 1884, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, and James G. Blaine from Maine. James G. Blaine, the man from Maine, a Republican. And neither of them was president. This was a race of two people who were vying for the presidency. Well, Grover Cleveland was a bachelor. But he had been accused, he was accused in this election, of fathering a child out of wedlock. It turns out that, in fact, was true, and he admitted it. Nevertheless, it became this big scandal that was thrown at Cleveland by the Republicans, by Blaine's Republican Party, to the point of, and this is really why I'm sharing this with you, of one of the great political cartoons in American history. This is a Republican cartoon. That is, the big fellow is supposed to be Cleveland. And the little baby in arms there. I want my paw. I want my paw. And that became this refrain, Ma, Ma, where's my paw? You know, this guy had fathered this child out of wedlock. And again, he admitted it. But nevertheless, this is pretty scandalous. Well, very close election. Grover Cleveland and the Democrats won. And so the answer to Ma, Ma, where's my paw went to the White House. Ha, ha, ha. So again, that's not misinformation. That's just dirty pool, though. Anyway. And my last example is not a presidential election, but it's a Senate race in 1950 between Richard Nixon and Helen Gahagan Douglas. And I think most of us have heard of Richard Nixon and remember, some of us, Richard Nixon. Helen Gahagan Douglas is sort of a figure that has receded. This was the U.S. Senator from California race. Helen Gahagan Douglas had been an actress, a performer, a singer, and she married an actor, and that her name was Helen Gahagan. She married Melvin Douglas. You ever seen the movie Ninotchka? No, nobody's ever seen that movie. It was made in 1939. Great movie. Melvin Douglas was a leading man, a very popular figure, and he was married to Helen Gahagan Douglas. Well, in this Senate race, Richard Nixon was already a congressman from Southern California, House of Representatives, and now he's running for the U.S. Senate. He's a Republican, of course, and she was a Democrat. He had cut his teeth from the time he entered the House of Representatives being an anti-communist. In his first term in 1946 to 48, he had led investigations into communists in the State Department, the famous Alger Hiss case. And in 1948, he continued to sit on the House Un-American Activities Committee and look for communists in the federal government, communists in the State Department, communists in Hollywood, communists in the professions, communists in the universities and academia. If you know anything about this era, the McCarthy era, it could have been called the Nixon era because Nixon was second to none in his red baiting, in his searching for communists. Helen Gahagan Douglas, married to a Hollywood star who was Jewish. She was somewhat liberal for the time. Well, this is where technology begins to be more sophisticated than the old newspapers. People apparently associated with Nixon's campaign, although Nixon always disavowed this. He said, I have nothing to do with this. But phone calls would be made to people. Hello? Do you know that Helen Gahagan Douglas sleeps with a Jew? Click. Do you know that Helen Gahagan Douglas is a communist? Click. Do you know that Helen Gahagan Douglas is pink right down to her underwear? This phone campaign, thousands and thousands of phone calls were made throughout California in the fall of 1950. You know, uncredited, not, hello, this is a message approved by Richard Nixon. Just these blasts telling all this information, this misinformation. That she was a communist sympathizer and all this stuff. And she really couldn't fight back very effectively because, again, I think one of the tricks, if you will, of dirty politics, attack your opponent before they attack you. If you level some charge, maybe the more outrageous the better, then you're going to have to make your opponent deny it or, even worse, ignore it. Nixon won the election to the United States Senate, and 2 years later was nominated for vice president, went on to be vice president, and again, eventually president. But it's from these early elections that he got the sobriquet of Tricky Dick. So this is the cover of a book about that campaign by a guy named Greg Mitchell, Tricky Dick and the Pink Lady. And Helen Gahagan Douglas, that was the end of her attempt to get into politics. One of the things that I think is sort of interesting about Nixon, and again, if you know what happened to Nixon eventually, right? First of all, as running for vice president, he had to deny some corruption and kickbacks. He got elected vice president. He lost the governorship of California in 1962, and he vowed that he would never be in politics again. This is my last press conference. Well, 4 years later, he was back. He ran for the presidency in 1968, won a very contested election. And then, of course, the Watergate scandal doomed his presidency. So he had to resign. But this label of Tricky Dick always followed him. And some of the men who were involved in the Watergate scandal, Donald Segretti, I know, was one of them, and a few others, had been graduate students, political science students, at USC and had participated in the 1950 campaign. So this 1950 campaign was in some ways sort of a warm-up to some of Nixon's dirty tricks later on. But again, the last thing I'll end with is all of those other things I've talked about somehow had to do with sex. You know, the accusations of Adams and his mistress, Jefferson and his mistress in the slave quarters, Mrs. Jackson being apparently a bigamist, and then, of course, Grover Cleveland and his fathering this child out of wedlock. For all that many people could say and did say about Richard Nixon, nobody ever accused Nixon of any sexual misconduct, which is kind of ironic for a guy named Dick, isn't it? Okay, with that inappropriate comment, I'll turn it back over to Cindi.
There's a lot of negative campaigning. I want to focus a little bit on misinformation and its intentional use to try to sway elections in a very particular way. This topic is so broad that I kind of freaked myself out a little bit when I was putting things together, and I don't have like 12 hours. I only have a little bit of time. So I'm going to try and narrow my focus down a little bit. But I did want to start by making a distinction for the purposes of my comments between fake news and false news, because I think that what's happened in the sort of current political environment is what we used to call fake news, which I will hopefully not refer to as fake news, but refer to as false news, the term fake news has come to mean anything that the media posts, anything that's presented in the media or online or in a newspaper or something that you don't happen to like, right? So in that sense, fake news, in the sense that the media sometimes publishes stuff that people in power don't want to hear, has been around forever. It's part of the free and open exchange of ideas, and we raise very serious questions of censorship and overreach of the government when we try to stop that kind of news. What I want to focus on a little bit is actual false news. News that is, to the extent that anything can be, demonstrably false, clearly made up with the intention of swaying people's votes, or maybe even more importantly, in the context of an election, affecting voter turnout or discouraging people to vote or sowing confusion about the election. As a political scientist, I'm concerned about negative ads. I'm concerned about disinformation in the sense of putting together an ad that has a little kernel of truth, but that is largely misleading. But I think that there's an argument that can be made that the more sort of sinister danger comes from efforts to interfere, not necessarily with the free and open flow of ideas. We have some ways of combating that, although part of the burden is on us to understand it when we see it. But I think there is a danger if we don't confront efforts to actually interfere through the use of information and misinformation and sowing of discord with the actual election itself. I will point out that there's very little research that's been done that shows that misinformation has, it's very hard to quantify exactly what the impact on an election could be. We can't really point to an election and say, absent this ad or absent people being exposed to this conspiracy theory, this other candidate would have won. So part of the concern that people have is of potential interference and potential effects. And what I can't talk about, because it's a little bit beyond the scope of my mandate that I was given with this topic, as everybody probably knows, the federal government is doing an investigation to try to figure out how Russia interfered with our election. So I'm not going to touch on things like hacking into elections or manipulating ballots and that kind of stuff, because it goes a little bit against what I was asked to talk about. So this discussion of misinformation and how it is transmitted in a sort of modern technology is one piece of a larger concern about the interference by people who, under our law, are not supposed to be interfering in our elections, right? It is actually illegal under federal law for foreign governments to purchase campaign ads and to try to manipulate the outcome of political elections. And so in some ways, what we're talking about is trying to figure out, I don't know if there are any other chairs. There's a chair over there if you want to sit on a chair. It's okay. I didn't mean to, I don't want to call attention to people. But anyway, so I want to talk about a little bit about if the problem isn't new, what is new? And I think that probably, at least from my perspective, what's new is the scope. What's new is the ease with which information is transmitted and the sort of sheer volume of misinformation and its potential impacts on what people believe. I'm not a psychologist, but from what I've read and from the studies that I've looked at, part of the concern about misinformation in a sort of internet era is we tend to, because we're human beings and we're imperfect, we tend to believe things are true the more often we hear them repeated. And so part of the concern that some people have about some of the misinformation that's being portrayed in American elections, and not just in elections, but in other areas of life as well, and we focus on elections because I'm a political scientist, but you could think about any kind of information about false news that's being presented about famous people or products or anything like that. We focus on elections in that sense. So I did a little bit of research, and I did look at a couple of studies that I could find trying to kind of quantify the extent to which misinformation by particular, I don't want to say nefarious, but I'll say it anyway because I think it's kind of sneaky, misinformation perpetrated possibly by enemies of the United States, in particular Russia and other people who don't have any business getting involved in American politics, but also by people who aren't actually people. So one of the concerns is in the studies of misinformation is trying to figure out how much of the misinformation comes from actual people getting involved in the political process in ways that people have always gotten involved in the political process, which is by publishing things and posting things on their blogs and talking to their friends and that kind of stuff, versus misinformation that is intentionally put into the political process by people who know that it's false and put it out anyway in the form of sort of artificial intelligence or things that are commonly referred to as like bots. Or if it's in the context of Facebook, fake accounts that are established and then either share or post links to false information or spread false information that way. The studies that I looked at particularly at Twitter. So there was one study that came out of, I think it was the University of Southern California, where they took like 400,000 Twitter accounts. They used some fancy schmancy scientific mechanism for trying to determine which of the tweets probably came from bots and which tweets probably came from actual humans. And their study concluded that approximately 15% to 20%, more than 3.8 million tweets, probably got tweeted and retweeted, and they were initially put into the political discourse through the use of bots. And if this is a sort of infant way of participating in the political process, what we would expect as political scientists is, as more and more people become more and more familiar with methods of dispersing misinformation, more and more people are going to begin using it. And so there are some, politics doesn't always lag behind technology, but eventually politics always catches up with new technology, so that just as people can use technology to promote products or to try to direct traffic to their websites, politicians and other political actors can also do the same thing. So it's making use of new technology and using it in a political way. So part of the concern is about the sort of sheer volume and scope and reach of information and how much more quickly it can be transmitted. And the concern about things like Twitter and Facebook is that if an organization like the Russian government is the one that we're sort of really worried about in terms of them finding ways to interfere with American elections, if they can set up thousands and thousands and thousands of false accounts, and then each of those accounts puts out information, then what ends up happening is that people get that information, then they retweet it or they share it, and then it just spreads exponentially faster and faster. And the concern that some people have about bots is that bots can put out information much more quickly than a human can. And so there's a lot of research being done on trying to figure out how to identify something that's probably put forth by a bot versus something that's put forth by an actual human being. And part of me wants to say maybe it doesn't matter who's putting out the information, but there's something distasteful about computer-generated false information, especially when we don't know who it's coming from. One of the things that we've tried to do in American political law is to structure the law so that even if we can't control the content of a message, we can try to create a political environment in which you know who's paying for the content or who's putting the content together. And so for traditional media, like the broadcast media or cable or newspapers or radio stations, or even campaign literature that's spread through sent through the mail, federal law requires that those ads identify who paid for the ad or who's sponsoring the ad, so that as a voter, you can take that information and use it as part of your calculus as to whether or not you're going to discount that information or whether or not you're going to vote for that person based on that information. Federal law currently doesn't apply to internet communications. And so part of the problem that was identified in the 2016 election, and that Facebook and Twitter and the government are trying to figure out how to potentially avoid for the 2018 election, is that it appears that, at least the indictments that have come down from the federal government appear to at least suggest that the Russian government was able to purchase ads and put forth misinformation into the public dialogue without anybody really being able to identify that that's where they came from. So not only was that sort of illegal, because Russia's not supposed to do that, but it also makes it it withholds information from American citizens that we might want to either keep out of the public dialogue or at least disclose to people. So that's part of the problem, is the scope and reach of information and concerns about bots. Interference by foreign actors is a lot of where the current dialogue is happening, because there's very little that the federal government or even state governments can do to control the content of information put into the public sphere through the normal discourse of politics. The Supreme Court's been pretty consistent in its rulings about the First Amendment. And just to give you a couple of examples, one of the things that I get from my students all the time is, why are politicians allowed to lie about each other? Why are people allowed to put out campaign ads that maybe have a kernel of truth, but are exaggerated or paint somebody in a bad light. Part of the answer to the question is maybe not a very satisfactory answer, is that in the United States, we don't allow the government, and I don't know, maybe I'm just Pollyanna, I think it's probably a good thing to not let the government decide what gets to be published and what doesn't get to be published. But generally speaking, almost every interpretation of the First Amendment that has come down from the courts, liberal or conservative courts, really sends a message that solving the problem of misinformation by trying to legislate away the misinformation is probably not going to be constitutionally upheld. So a lot of states have tried to do this. So for example, the state of Ohio, the state of Washington, a couple of other states passed legislation that essentially allowed candidates to file a grievance with the state if they felt that somebody had put forth misleading information about their candidacy in an attempt to discredit their candidacy, and it allowed people to essentially sue, not for libel, which is a different legal standard, but for putting out false or misleading information in an attempt to promote one person's candidacy or interfere with another person or keep another person from winning. And although the United States Supreme Court has not definitively ruled on it, all of the lower appeals courts that have heard those cases have almost unanimously struck them down as a violation of the First Amendment. So that might not be an avenue when we start to look at what potentially our solutions to the problem might be. The other case that is an interesting case, just because I like Supreme Court cases, but it's a Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Alvarez that was decided in 2012, and it involved a federal law which attempted to make it a crime to knowingly, falsely claim that you had won a military honor that you had not actually won. One of the ways that people try to get elected is by playing up their military service and sometimes exaggerating their valor. In this case, Alvarez actually claimed to have won in some like presidential citation that he didn't actually get. The Supreme Court struck that law down, and they said, you know, in the context of a campaign, the value of the free and open exchange of ideas protects even lies, right? So I'm not sure that that is an avenue that we could go down. But we can talk about some of the things that are of particular concern that we really maybe do want to try to combat. And one of the big ones that gets a lot of attention, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but I just want to throw it out there to give you a chance to give me some examples. Misleading campaign ads is one concern that we have. Conspiracy theories is another, and conspiracy theories spread much more quickly than they used to. In the context of elections, what are some of the more modern viral conspiracy theories that were out there in the last couple of election cycles? Yeah. Ted Cruz looked like the Zodiac Killer, or that he was. Yeah, so Ted Cruz looks like the Zodiac Killer would probably not be a conspiracy theory. Ted Cruz is the Zodiac Killer would probably be a conspiracy. So they can come from the left or from the right. Yeah, Zach. What's that? Trump is like the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. Yeah. Conspiracy theories that come from the left often deal with Nazism and ties to Nazism. There was just one during the Kavanaugh hearing. I guess one of Kavanaugh's aides gave somebody the OK sign, and the way she was holding her hand, the left-wing conspiracy theorists were saying that that's a symbol of white supremacy, so she must belong to a white supremacist group, and it's something because it's white power. Yeah, the way she was, anyway, yeah. The Obama birth certificate, classic, right? That Barack Obama was not actually born in the United States, that he was not legitimately entitled to be president of the United States. There was one from the 2016 election that got a lot of attention. Pizzagate, which involved what? What was the charge in Pizzagate? That's right, that Hillary Clinton and some of her colleagues were actually running a child sex ring out of a pizza parlor, right? Yeah, so We don't actually know because we don't ask people, we don't make people tell us why they voted. I mean, we ask them, but people don't have to tell us. But you don't have to write down on your ballot, these are the things that influenced my decision in the last election, and one of them was, Pizzagate or whatever. So we can't quantify the impact that could have on the election. Studies show that political scientists who study negative information and the spreading of viral conspiracies and that kind of stuff, the concern that political scientists have about stuff like that is, one, it's false information that makes people base their voting decisions on things that maybe they shouldn't. But there's a concern that it makes people mistrustful of government across the board, and that it can negatively impact voter turnout. That people get the impression that if everybody is so corrupt, if nobody has anybody's good intentions in mind, then maybe we shouldn't bother to vote and that kind of stuff. So conspiracy theories, something that we are concerned about. And then the third thing, and I think this is probably, from my perspective, something that maybe we don't talk about enough, or maybe that we should pay a little bit more attention to, and that's efforts to interfere with the actual conduct of the elections through the spreading of misinformation, whether it's misinforming people about how to vote or ways that they can vote, suggesting to people that their vote won't count unless they do certain things, telling people that there's going to be police officers checking warrants. If you go to vote and you have an outstanding warrant, you're going to get arrested. Those kinds of things can, if they spread and if they're not checked, can really have an impact on elections that is of concern to political scientists today. Here's an example of one. This is a photoshopped picture of, I can't remember, Aziz Ansari, yeah. And it's basically, he's holding up a sign saying, telling people that they can text their vote to this number, that if you, text your vote and then your vote will count. There were tons of these in the 2016 election. And now it's tempting to say, well, if people are so stupid, sorry, I don't mean to say you're stupid, but if people are so stupid that they actually think you can vote by texting, then they deserve to have their vote not count. But on the other hand, if there's something that we can do about this, maybe we want to do something about it. I can tell you, it is actually against the law to try to interfere with the conduct of elections. So we do have laws against fraud. The question is, of course, how do you find the people and how do you prosecute them and that kind of stuff. So I want to talk just a little bit because I have no idea what time it is. Oh my God! All right, let me go faster than I was going to go. Oh, okay, thanks. I don't want to watch. So if it's a problem, if you don't think it's a problem, then you don't have to think it's a problem. But if you think it's a problem, then the question becomes, what can we do about it? And I did want to touch on a little bit of what's currently being done to try to combat misinformation. One is industry responses and self-regulation, right? So because industries don't like to be regulated by the government, so Facebook and Twitter and some of the other social media platforms are actually making some efforts. We don't know how successful their efforts are going to be, but we do know that Facebook and Twitter have begun to take down accounts if they're knowingly false accounts to try to stem the tide of misinformation. And we'll see, apparently the internet and social media is one of the least regulated industries in the country. The broadcast media is much more, although we have a free press, but there are a lot more regulations on the media in terms of not what they can publish in terms of campaign ads, but how the ads have to be disclosed in terms of who pays for them and that kind of stuff. There are a lot of efforts being made globally. There are a lot of countries that are either considering legislation to try to combat misinformation or that have already passed legislation. Some of those countries don't really have a tradition of press freedom, and so the things that they're doing are things that we could never do, like give the government the authority to censor anybody who pisses off the government, essentially. And so some countries like Belarus and Russia and Singapore don't really have a tradition of press freedom, but they are trying to crack down. the concern that people have about those efforts is that they might just be thinly veiled efforts by the government to censor. And we certainly don't want to go down that road in the United States. Other countries like Denmark and Sweden, France, and some other countries are looking at the problem sort of the way we are, which is how can we work with social media platforms to try to get the misinformation taken down, and to have a sort of second piece, which is increasing people's media awareness so that people don't fall victim to the misinformation. And so in a lot of countries, and I think this is the direction probably the United States is going to go, it's going to be sort of a two-tiered approach, right? How do we educate the public not to fall victim to it, and also how do we work with social media providers to either treat campaign advertising the way the broadcast media do, in terms of putting new regulations on them about disclosure and about keeping records and not selling their ads in rubles, apparently, to foreign actors who aren't supposed to be doing that. Germany is probably has the most, one that's gotten the most attention. They've actually have a fairly significant potential fine of millions and millions of dollars against like Facebook or Twitter or something if they don't take false sites down within a certain period of time. They're also going after what we would call in the United States hate speech, but we really can't, at least now, do that in the United States because hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. So some countries are attempting things that we wouldn't be able to do in the United States under the current political climate. But there are a couple of efforts. The state of California just passed a law, it was just signed into law not too long ago, a couple weeks ago, that establishes a new department within the state government that will essentially go after people who are doing the sort of fraudulent, don't forget to vote on Wednesday, elections are on Tuesdays, and trying to depress voter turnout by giving people misinformation about the election. It's already illegal to do that, but the state of California is trying to ramp up its enforcement, and so they're working with social network providers, and they're working with local governments to see if we can get a hold of. The attempt is going to be to try to get that stuff taken down as quickly as possible so that it doesn't spread as quickly, and then to counteract with messages from the government clarifying the information or making sure that the appropriate information gets out there. Who knows, right? These things work, they might not work. And then there are some efforts, the federal government is also considering, we know that there have been some indictments that have come down against representatives of the Russian government who are like in Russia. So whether we're going to actually be able to prosecute them, we don't know. We have put some sanctions on Russia, but there is a bill pending in the United States House and the Senate. It's been introduced in both the House and Senate. It's called the Honest Ads Act. If it passes, it will be called the Honest Ads Act. And what it would do, amongst other things, is it's not a content-based law. We don't allow the government to censor the content of media information. But what it would do is it would apply some of the same regulations that we have for broadcast media to internet platforms, so that if somebody buys an ad on Facebook, they will have to disclose who they are, how much money they've spent, who's sponsoring the ad, so that we, as consumers, can have information. It's what we in poli-sci speak like to call a sunshine law or a disclosure law. So it's not going to solve the problem in the sense that there will be no more negative ads on television or no more negative ads on the internet, but it's a way of trying to grapple with the problem in the context of a constitution that protects free speech pretty significantly. And I already talked about this because it occurred to me to talk about it earlier. This is the biggest concern this is maybe the biggest, I don't want to call it a barrier, but an impediment to the United States sort of cracking down on misinformation, is that the First Amendment in some ways protects the disbursement of misinformation. And so if the government isn't going to be the solution, and if industry is going to maybe imperfectly solve the problem, the question becomes, what can we do? And I would just beg you, and you've probably, if you've been to more than one of these talks, you've probably been begged already, Don't be a part of the problem, right? Recognize your own role in the spread of misinformation and try not to do it. One of the things that we should be aware of and try to avoid is a phenomenon called confirmation bias. When we hear things that reinforce stuff that we already kind of believe, we tend to not question its validity. And so we're likely to forward that conspiracy theory or buy into that misinformation without trying to think to ourselves, does that even actually make logical sense? That somebody was telling me that they had seen this statistic that 75% of the people in California's prisons are illegal immigrants. Like, okay, does that even make logical sense to you? Knowing it's like, okay, it's easy to find the information. It's available. We keep stats on stuff like that. So check your biases. It's very easy to see confirmation bias in other people. It's very difficult to see it in ourselves. Avoid retweeting or sharing questionable material. Don't be the person who sends the link to the InfoWars website or whatever the left's website is, so we can stop it from spreading maybe so virally. Be a more savvy political media consumer. There are a lot of websites that you can go to get information about how to evaluate the news. And just to give you a little example of one, it's called Fact Check. It's actually put out by the Annenberg School of Communication. And they have some videos, I don't know if it'll come up. They have some videos and stuff on how you can evaluate news. And one of the things that pieces of advice that they give that I haven't seen a lot of discussions of this talk about is go to the website where the information came from and look at what else is published on that website. And if that website is publishing things about aliens infiltrating, causing earthquakes to happen, maybe that media source isn't a very good source. The other thing that you should keep in mind is if something's a legitimate news story, it's probably going to be covered by more than one media outlet. It's probably not going to be covered just by one right-wing or left-wing media outlet, right? It's going to